But thank y'all so much for being here. As Clint said, my name's Joshua Davis, and we're doing this every other week. So the first and third Friday of every month. And it's our first one. And so we're glad everyone's here. And what we want to do is provide some studies for all of you that are relevant kind of to what you're doing here, kind of what you're experiencing in life in general. And then hopefully these are encouraging and they minister to you and you can take them home and really apply them. And so we're going to get started today, but I wanted to ask you guys a question. Have you ever wondered, why am I here? Yeah. Now, not necessarily at Cable Quest, but in life. Why?
I'll ask you.
But
If for law, at law, and what I love with dog is a green food that is you live forever and never eat it. And you home that.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, what about life in general? So that's being with God eternally. But what about just why am I here today? Why am I going through certain things in my life that God is allowing me to go through, some of the struggles that I'm facing, some of the good times, some of the bad times, but just a lot of questions around why am I going through this? Well, I want to tell you a story about a country called Israel. Now, some of you may be familiar with Israel in the Bible, and some of you may not, but let me kind of give you a little bit of an overview. So Israel was God's chosen people. They were the Jews. They were initially just the Israelites, but then later were called the Jews, God's chosen people. And when the nation first started out, God gave them 10 rules, plus a few extra, but 10 primary rules. We call them the 10 Commandments. And he said, all right, I want you to abide by these rules. Now, these weren't rules that were for them to be quote unquote good people. These were rules designed to keep them safe. And today we look at a lot of the things we know about health and sanitary purposes and all those things. The Israelites didn't know that, but God had designed these rules to keep his people safe, to keep them healthy, and to prosper them. But Israel had a problem. Now, how many of you have kids? I have 4 kids, and most of the time the kids do a great job. But sometimes, when you tell your child not to do something, what do? They do it anyway. They want to see how far they can get without getting in trouble. Well, Israel kind of did the same thing. God gave them his 10 commandments. He gave them some laws, some statutes. He said, all right, don't go beyond this. Unfortunately, Israel went way beyond it. If there was a line, they jumped way beyond the line. And so they got to a point where God said, I gave you a standard, but you kind of missed that. Now you're going into outside of really what is beneficial for you. And so God raised up a number of folks throughout the Old Testament. Some of these were prophets. Some of these were judges. It depends on the history of Israel, but essentially God raised up people to come into Israel, to speak into their lives and say, wait a minute, you've gone too far. God had a design. God had a purpose. You've gone way too far, and you need to come back. You need to correct your actions. And sometimes if they didn't correct their action, these folks were responsible for pronouncing judgment. Most of the time, Israel didn't repent. So that judgment, unfortunately, happened. But God raised up a number of folks in the Old Testament to speak into their life, to give them truth, to give them some hard counsel and say, well, back up. One of these folks was Jeremiah. Now, there's a whole book in the Bible dedicated to Jeremiah. But when you look at Jeremiah, God had a purpose for Jeremiah's life. Okay? And we see that if you read through the book of Jeremiah, God gave Jeremiah some pretty hard things to say to Israel. he wasn't their friend. I mean, they didn't like him. There's even stories where Jeremiah at one point had to hang his underwear into a rock and then go back and get it a couple of days later. I mean, God made Jeremiah do some pretty strange things. And in this entire time, God says, I have a purpose for you. I have a plan for why you were created. Oops. Jeremiah 1, verses 4 through 5 says, Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Starting out, Jeremiah's just hanging out, doing his own thing. And God shows up and says, Jeremiah, you may not realize it, but there's a purpose for why you were created. I have a plan for you. And then you may be wondering, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what God's doing in my life, if God even exists or if God even cares. But we see that Jeremiah may have been thinking the same thing at some point. And God shows up and says, no, I've got a purpose for you. And there's a couple of words I want to point out to you. First, God said, I formed you. It's almost like a potter taking clay. It doesn't just throw a lump of clay on there and something pops up. God, like a potter, is working that clay, molding it, and forming it to his purpose. Whether it's a bowl, whether it's a vase, God has a purpose for why he's molding that piece of pottery the way he's doing it. He did that with Jeremiah. He says, I'm forming you for a specific reason. And you're going to do something based on how I've created you. And then God says, I knew you in the womb. I knew you. I knew you when I created you. You see, it didn't just happen and you popped out of your mom and then I came up with some kind of strange idea of how I'm going to use you. I created you while you're still in your mom's womb. And I knew you then. You may not have known me, but I knew everything about you. And he says, before you were born, I consecrated you. Now that's a big fancy word, and it simply means I've set you apart for a specific reason. I've set you apart for a purpose. You're not generic. There's only one of you. And I know who you are. I formed you for a reason, and I've set you apart for a purpose. And for Jeremiah, his purpose was, I appointed you as a prophet. I've called you to be a preacher. I've called you to deliver a message to Israel. Well, let me stop there for a second. If you ever gone into a pottery shop, usually there's two major sections in a pottery shop. When you first walk in, they're going to have all their pristine, all their beautiful pottery up front. Why is that? They want to sell it. They're going to charge more for the beautiful pieces of pottery. But in the back, they realize that not everyone wants the most expensive pottery. And the potter doesn't want to waste any of their time or any of their clay either. So they have a section in the back called their seconds. These are pieces that there's some kind of defect. They're not 100% perfect, but they're okay. I can still sell them. And so the potter sells them at a discount. What God is telling Jeremiah here is that you're not a second. What God's telling us is that you're not a second. You're not on the back table. You're on the front table. You are who I am most proud of. Now, for Jeremiah, for Israel, for us today, there's a difference between God saying, I'm proud of your actions and I'm proud of you. Let's make sure we're clear with that. There are times where God is not proud of our action, but that doesn't remove God's pride over us. And I just want y'all to understand that if you hear nothing else today, God is proud of you. There is a specific reason He's created you. There's a specific purpose for why He has designed you. Ephesians 2:10 says this. He says, "For we are His workmanship. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." God has created good works for us. Before we were born, before you're whatever age you are today, God has created good works that He wants you to walk in. Before time, before you were created, think about it. 2,000 years ago, God knew you would be sitting here today. God knew about your life 2,000 years ago. And you may be saying, well, if God knew about it, then why is He allowing me to go through what I'm going through? Well, there's a purpose for it. That may not sound like good news, but there is a purpose for that. And I can tell you that, I've been through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering in my life. And I look back and realize I didn't like it during the time I was going through it. It's never fun. But there's a reason God had me go through it. I was sharing a little bit about that earlier with some folks, but understanding that life gets hard sometimes. But I look back and I think about all the lessons I've learned in the process. I want to finish our time together today. Keep it very short because I don't want to keep y'all from all your responsibilities, but I want to share a story with y'all and finish our time together. In 1858, in Boston, there was a gentleman by the name of Edward Kimball. The name isn't important, but just understand that this guy, there was nothing special about him. But Edward Kimball was a Sunday school teacher. He had a job during the day, but on Sundays, he taught Sunday school. He taught Sunday school for young boys. And Edward Kimball said in his heart, I don't care what it takes. Every single boy that I teach, I'm going to tell them about Jesus. That was his purpose. And so one day, Edward Kimball had a young man in his Sunday school class who worked at a shoe store. He was a sales clerk. And this was a young man who Edward said, I need to share Jesus with him. And so Edward went over to the shoe store one day and shared the story of Jesus with a kid named Dwight L. Moody. Now, if you don't know who Dwight L. Moody is, Dwight L. Moody became a huge, famous evangelist and a theologian. And so many people was led to Jesus Christ by Dwight L. Moody. There's books that he's written. People have collected sermons that he's spoken. But he's done so much for the kingdom. And it started with Edward Kimball, who was a Sunday school teacher, who said, I am going to make a commitment to share Jesus with every single student in my class. So Dwight L. Moody grows up, and guess what? He is no longer a kid working at a shoe store. Dwight L. Moody becomes an evangelist, like I said earlier, a very well-known, famous evangelist. And one day, Dwight's telling the story of how Edward led him as a young boy to Jesus. And it impresses another gentleman by the name of Frederick Meyer. Frederick Meyer is at this point a pastor. Not well known, not famous. No one probably even knows who Frederick Meyer is to this day. Never became famous. Nonetheless, Frederick still becomes an evangelist. He's so inspired by Dwight's own testimony of how God led a Sunday school teacher to tell him about Jesus that Frederick's wondering, Well, who am I telling about Jesus? Who am I going and sharing the story with? And so Frederick eventually begins preaching here in the United States, traveling around, also an evangelist. And then one day, as he's teaching, as he's preaching, another man who is a priest or preacher by the name of Wilbur Chapman hears his message. Wilbur is sitting at an evangelistic meeting that Frederick's preaching at, and Wilbur's hearing this, and Wilbur is so inspired to go tell people about Jesus. So Wilbur starts going around, and back in the 80s, 70s, and 60s, not so much today, but back then, we had a lot of what was called tent meeting. They had a lot of pastors going around, setting up these huge tents, and they'd go in and start preaching inside these tents, and people would come for a week and hear these evangelists teach. Well, Wilbur realized, I need some help doing this. I need some volunteers to help me set up the tents, set up chairs, tear everything down. And so he enlists a whole bunch of volunteers to help him. One of the volunteers is a guy named Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday is a volunteer, not a preacher, but then he hears what Wilbur's preaching. He starts watching Wilbur. He starts mimicking him. Saying, all right, if Wilbur's doing this, then I can do that too. And he starts, again, copying some of what Wilbur's doing. Billy becomes an evangelist. Billy ends up bringing thousands of people to Jesus. Keep in mind, this all started by a faithful Sunday school teacher. Well, Billy starts doing these tent meetings as well. And he does a couple in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a few businessmen say, I really appreciate that message. I see what he's doing. And these businessmen are from a small town. And they realize, we need to bring Jesus to our town. We need to tell people in our community about Jesus. And so what they do is they organize a set of meetings in their town. These aren't pastors. These aren't preachers. These aren't evangelists. These are just faithful people in business that create an opportunity. Well, then, at these meetings, they hire an evangelist named Mordecai Ham, another very popular evangelist at the time, leads thousands of people to Jesus. Mordecai is preaching the entire week. In this town, there's a farmer. Farmer isn't a preacher. He's not a priest. He doesn't know a lot about the Bible, but he does have a pickup truck. And the farmer says, I'm going to load as many people as I can into my pickup truck and drive them to these meetings. And so as he's loading his pickup truck, there's one young boy, a 16-year-old, who's interested. I don't have anything else to do. I'll hop in a truck and go listen to Mordecai preach. This young 16-year-old, every night, is listening to Mordecai. He's mesmerized by what Mordecai is teaching, what he's preaching. And at the very end of the week, on the very last night, this 16-year-old gives his life to Jesus. You probably have heard of him. His name is Billy Graham. And if you've never heard of Billy Graham has been known to reach hundreds of thousands of people, if not in the millions of people worldwide, for the gospel. What I want you to hear today is that I don't know if you're a Sunday school teacher. I don't know if you're a volunteer, business person, farmer. It doesn't matter. You may not be a preacher. You may not be an evangelist. It doesn't mean that God can't use you. God has a purpose for you. There's a specific reason why you've been created. And you may doubt that right now. I don't know. I just met a lot of y'all today. So thankful that you've introduced yourselves, but I don't know your history. God does. He knows what you've been through. He's been there every step of the way. And so I want you to hear, you're not an accident. There is a purpose for you. And some of you may think, well, I'm a product of unplanned pregnancy. My parents didn't mean for me to come out. It just kind of happened, and now they're stuck with me. And so I've kind of had to live with that my entire life. And they've always told me I'm an accident, but you're not. Despite what you may believe, God has a purpose for you. Today, you may be wondering, why am I downstairs on the line putting tables together? I don't get it. Maybe you're up here thinking I'm just going through my 8-to-5 job, clocking in, clocking out. But there's something more to your life than just this. Now, I'm not telling you to leave. Don't go anywhere. But your life is so much more than just your 8-to-5 job. God has a reason for you existing. So I just want to encourage you to know that you're not an accident. You have a purpose.